to Rise, Hope and Healing After Sexual Betrayal. Healing from sexual betrayal is not something you are meant to do alone. I am your hostess, MaryAnn Michaelis, and each week we feature conversations with experts in betrayal trauma recovery. If this podcast is helpful to you, we ask that you please share it so that someone else may not feel so alone. You can also find our companion course at humanintimacy.com. We're so glad that you're with us. Welcome to Rise. And for this episode, we've got Dr. Skinner back with us as we are continuing our conversation on grief. So Dr. Skinner, welcome back. And first thoughts, when we talk about grief, what comes to mind for you?
I think that when we speak about betrayal, a lot of individuals wouldn't use the word grief with it until they have settled into the process, the grieving of what I thought I knew, the grieving of the emotions, the grieving of what I feel about myself. Maybe I've acted in ways that I didn't want to act post betrayal. And so the grieving is a very real thing. I think it's giving a language to the experience. And I think that's something that comes with time. I don't know in the beginning if you can really give it a voice, but as you go through different seasons of the healing journey, I think you begin to realize that this is real legitimate grief.
So, would you agree with the statement that betrayal is grief? And I think what I'm hearing you say is that whole confusion at the beginning, that numbness where I can't even make sense, the shock, all of that is part of the grief process. But usually at that beginning stage, we don't really recognize because really this is just survival. This is just trying to find the next breath. And so I don't necessarily think this is grief
Mhm.
right now. I'm experiencing grief.
Exactly. So I think it's the shock. What is this? That initial feeling. You're not going to think, oh, I'm in grief. You're going to think about that maybe 6 months, a year into it, and the work and the fears and the worries and the world that you felt or thought you knew has changed and has been altered. And you yourself, the way you think, the way you feel, your experience is different than the past. And so it is a grieving that crosses over into many areas of life.
And I think the way that we're talking about it here is grief as a cognitive process, which is
Mm.
I'm realizing that this is grief and I'm starting to recognize that a huge part of grief is getting to that acceptance part. And the whole beginning part of this grieving after betrayal process is that shock, the confusion, then that pushing back. I don't want this, and just trying to figure out how to live my life. And so we were talking about when the dust starts to settle I can start saying, okay, this is grief. Now there are tasks that I need
Mhm.
to accomplish to get through this.
Yeah, a few years ago, I was studying about individuals who had lost someone to death. And there was an assessment that I found. It was post grief loss, is really what it was about, MaryAnn. And it explored how individuals respond to the death of a loved one. So usually they look at it 6 months afterwards and a hard time accepting what occurred. The emotions of, I still go through the emotions of things that I thought were in place and now I can't go to them and can't do certain things. And so don't throw away clothes. I keep clothes, or I won't do certain things in my house because are they going to come back? It's that type of a feeling. Obviously, we're talking about something very different, but I still think some of the principles hold true. A state of denial, a fear of what is this new world going to be like? And so some individuals are scared of paying bills. As some individuals, I've never had to do some of this stuff, and loss due to death versus loss of they're still present, they're still in my life. I'm still questioning what is this? How do I do this? Are you going to be there for me? And I don't know the answers to those questions. So I'm mentally thinking, what if I have to do this on my own?
So it's this really liminal kind of limbo state of I don't know if this relationship's ending. I don't know if it's over. I don't know what it's going to look like in the future. And so that even prolongs getting to that acceptance stage because it's not as final as death is. It's still trying to figure out what the relationship means and how to navigate all of the chaos that's still coming in after the betrayal.
So the state of limbo in conjunction with that is I don't know if my partner's engaging in a recovery process, trying to change their behaviors. Do I know if they're really doing that? Do I not know that? And so there's a lot of ambiguity in this space of uncertainty. I don't know answers. And so it's really a painful place to be in for an extended period of time. The research that I gathered previously suggests that over 50% of individuals have been experiencing these symptoms that we've talked about in the PTSD for over a year, and many of them 30 to 50% for more than 2 years. And so you start to see this extended period of time of a state of internal chaos where I feel like I don't know where my next step's going to be. I don't know what to do. And I think that's part of that process of, am I even supposed to grieve when I don't even know what to expect? And so that's where I think the grieving comes in as people start to analyze and realize this is a different life than I anticipated.
I want to be really honest, especially for our viewers and listeners. With this shift from the co-addict and codependency models and treating betrayal trauma to the betrayal trauma models, where we're looking at the PTSD. So we've had this shift in the last 10, 15 years that's been really significant, but there's a lot of gaps. There's some really big gaps. And I know when I look with my clients using the assessments that we have for trauma, they don't assess for grief. And
Mhm.
that's something that I know you and I were talking about when we were creating an assessment, which we'll have in our show notes for this. But there's a gap. When I've been doing research just recently, looking for grief after betrayal trauma, I'm not finding research articles that are done on that. And so we've been treating the PTSD part, we're recognizing it, but so often we forget to even help our clients understand this is grief. And as I've started asking my clients, what is it that needs to be grieved? I've been so shocked and
Mhm.
surprised at just the waterworks that come up because actually answering that question, what do I need to grieve? Oh, that's a whole nother compartment that most of the time we miss, or we're not
Mhm.
ready, or we're looking through these models and it's just kind of getting skipped over. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really great observation. When we look at individuals as they, I don't know what the best way to say this, Marianne, confront the new reality, there's no other way to look at it than this grieving process because we don't get married thinking I'm going to experience this kind of pain. And yet, when it is with us, many times I've heard individuals say, I told myself I would never deal with this. I'd never put up with it. And yet, here I am trying to make sense. Am I doing this? Am I not doing this? We've got children. How do we deal with finances? I don't want them to be away from my children, as an example. And so the world that I thought I knew is a grieving process. So, Marianne, I think it's a really big gap when we haven't explored what is the voice of that loss. I remember a few years ago talking with Ted Weird, who does grief with people who have passed away and helping them adjust to life after their loved ones have passed on. And his story is very profound, but something in my conversation with him that it's always stood out to me is he says it's really loss and then the grief. So the loss occurs and then this grief settles in. So you experience this. So we typically say grief and loss, but really it's loss and then grief. And I think he flips those words around intentionally because there is this loss, and then I have to grieve that loss of my life.
And if I want to take that a little bit further, because we're talking about grief, but let's dig into what it is, what the loss is. We lose the reality that we know, the world as we know it. We lose our identity. Who am I now? I can't even
Mhm.
make sense of who I am. And coupled with that is we lose a loss of our sense of worth. These are significant. These three key points I've pulled from some research shared by a therapist named Holly Kenley. And it
Mhm.
makes so much sense saying what I've lost is everything that kind of tethered me and grounded me to my sense of being.
I think that's right. And yet, as we begin to explore that process of working through it, it's hard to heal when you don't have a language for it. And that's why I think the work that you're doing is so important here is we have to start giving a language to this experience because without it, we have feelings, we have thoughts, we have emotions, but how do you make sense of them? And so when you give a language to something, it actually helps you understand yourself more. I don't know, more effectively might be the word. It helps you see yourself and what you're truly experiencing, giving a language to it.
And I love this because as we've been talking, I'm thinking about my own personal journey and early on. as I was trying to figure out how do I interface with my world with
Mm,
appropriate boundaries, trying to function. I remember I would tell people, and this is something I've encouraged my clients to use as well. And in this conversation, I'm realizing it needs to shift a little bit. But, I would tell people, I can't help with that. Thank you for asking. Or they'd say, how are you? And I'd say, I'm working through some personal things, which was true. But
mm,
how much more meaningful and validating for myself would it have been to have said, I'm grieving right now,
mm,
working through some grief. It just feels like it hits home for me, at least, so much more deeply and so much
mm.
more validating of where I really was.
And in our society, people may say to that, MaryAnn, "So, oh, did you lose a loved one?"
Right.
Right? Because we associate
Like,
grief with death and dying
right.
rather than the grief of emotional experiences or lost things that are not happening in our world. I can grieve over the loss of a job. I can grieve over a mistake that I've made. Again, I can grieve over lots of things. And so even the language we're trying to incorporate here or implement here, it may be misunderstood because, oh, who died? Did your mom, dad die? I mean, that type of thing.
Right. So let's figure this out because I'm thinking, how could I say that in a way that fully honors that and lets me step into it? So maybe I would say, I'm experiencing some, I don't know, Dr. Skinner, what would you say?
I think the most accurate is I'm dealing with some grief in relationships. So it's relationships, right? Because it's influencing multiple parts of your relationship with what the world you knew, the relationship that you currently have, and the worries and the fears that are associated with it. So I might tie it to relationships so that it's more clear or specific.
Thank you. I love that we don't come in here with a script and this pushes me. I think for me, to be honest, I think I would want to say I've experienced some things that have been really hard relationally, which have caused me some loss of my stability, even with my relationship with myself, and I'm grieving that.
Yes.
And
There's a voice, right?
so I'm honoring where I'm at. I'm not saying, hey, let me tell you about my loved one that passed away, but what I've experienced has really made me question myself
Mm.
and my world, and I'm grieving that.
Yeah, and I think, MaryAnn, you're talking about this almost a collapse of that inner self, that inner confidence, that inner whatever perception of self that is often attacked, so to speak, in betrayal. And individuals reclaiming that self is actually part of the grieving process of coming back to or refining yourself in a new way. And I think that's part of the solution here. But you can't do it until you have understood how to give it a voice, a meaning. And I think that's the importance of starting point here. And as we continue to look through this, it's as some people say, when we go through adversity, we often come out stronger, better, more defined, more clarity of who we are.
I want to highlight that a little bit because I know in a previous podcast, it might have been the Human Intimacy podcast, we recently talked about attachment styles. And I think that when we're really working through this grieving process, I think it's about reattaching with ourselves. And because we lose that sense of who we are, we lose that sense of our reality. And it comes back to I've got to securely attach to myself to find my
Mm,
voice, to find my story, to recreate my reality, to re identify my worth.
mm,
And because I may have found my worth in the relationship with my partner, and I have to bring that into securely attaching with myself. And one of the things that we're kind of poking around, but we haven't outright stated that I think is super important is part of healing, part of forgiveness is creating that trauma narrative. It is finding the places to make sense of our story, to put it together and to be able to share it out loud, to have it be witnessed and held. And as we do, at least in my experience, every time I've told my story, it's different. Some things are more important, some things are less important, some things fall out at the bottom, other things are like, oh, and I want to illustrate this. I was going through some of my old journals recently from my childhood. There were some hard things, and I reached out to one of my siblings and said, help me make sense of this, because this is my reality. Like, how off was I? And my sister gave me some insight that made everything click together. And without that outside perspective of somebody saying, this is what it feels like, this is what it sounds like, we
mm,
need that. I needed that. I think we all need that.
And again, there's a place where you took someone else who had been in a similar experience and had been a part of that journey to help
Right.
give a language to, which can be a very valuable point here, MaryAnn, because when we have people who can share or have commonality with what we've experienced, the grieving can be lessened because we have support. Recently, just paralleling this to somebody who went through the loss of a loved one many years ago, I was recently talking to them. They're a friend of the family, and their father passed away, I think, about 20 years ago. And as we were talking, she said, "It's interesting that I can talk with you in ways that I can't talk with anybody else because of our shared experience around her father and the time that he died, because I was there and I knew the family and we interacted a lot." And she said, "I can talk with you, but I go to other people and I don't have that shared experience." And I think that's part of what we're talking about here is when we go through the grieving process, maybe this is one of the things that's most helpful is I can go through this and share a moment or memories with you that we create about our experiences that join us together. That's the power of a group or a person that you trust that you can talk to and open up with.
And I find that even in the therapy office, my clients will say something, and I have to laugh a little bit because I say, I'm going to share something that I remember that you shared. It wasn't my memory, I wasn't there, but I remember you shared this with me. And when I can bring it back in, oftentimes my clients will
Mm.
say, Oh my goodness, I didn't even realize those connected.
Mm.
But they connect. And so we need the spaces of somebody else's prefrontal cortex to help us make sense of our reality. And that helps us validate, oh yeah, oh yeah, that is really valid. It's
Hmm.
once again that I think that self-attachment that we're looking for.
And when we have a voice for grieving, a language for it, we can express it, and other people can be with us in that grief. We feel that, use the word validated, we feel understood, we feel heard and listened to. And that then also validates that this feeling isn't, I'm not losing it, I'm not going crazy. And that's a part of it is to be heard in that suffering that helps us through this grieving process. And I think that it truly may be one of the best things that a person can do who's giving a voice to their grieving to be able to have someone who can witness it.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And I've also seen and experienced reaching out to somebody who can't hold it,
Mm.
who can't handle it, who can't hear it, who's not helpful. And that can also feel like another betrayal. I reached out to you in my time of need. This is so hard, and you're not there for me. And so now I'm even more alone and more isolated. And this is even so much harder because where do I go? More loss.
And fear that people won't be there. So I have seen in situations like this where people have maybe tried to turn to family members and the family members weren't able to be there with them, or in some situations gave them like, oh, and we've experienced this. And so now my perception of what I thought was a strong relationship, or maybe mom and dad or sister or whatever it may be, and now I'm like, is this everybody's world? And so this crumbling of this perception of the world that I had or thought I had is now in this place of disarray. What's real? And that then is finding people who can genuinely be there, and that means that we have to find our tribe. And I don't know how else to say that. We need to find the people who genuinely understand us, who care about us, that we can say, wow, you truly understand me.
I don't speak German, but as I've been reading, I came across a word schmerz. And it's SCHMERZ. Are you familiar with that word?
No, tell me about it.
Okay. So, from someone who doesn't speak German, who read about this, here we go. But as I've looked at this word, it talks about pain. It's like a word for pain, but it encompasses emotional and mental. It's not just I'm feeling pain, but it encompasses all of that deep,
Mhm.
soul sucking anguish that we experience. And I want to make sure that we're really touching on just the depth as we're talking about grief and loss as concepts. These are s- deep ruptures that really skew how we see the world, how we feel. And what I'm trying to say is it's hard to find the words to even put around this
Mm.
concept of grief and loss because it's so deep and so painful, and you can lose your breath, you lose your footing.
So, Marianne, as you described that, you can just feel the pain of it, feel the loss of it, feel that part. And what I would also add to this, anytime we speak of grief, we have to also see the other side of resiliency. And my point there is while we honor the grief and have a language for it, we also see the resiliency of our human race, that people get through things like this, that they get stronger. And that shift into this place of giving a voice, honoring, respecting, being with people, that part of it is so essential. Because I think if you just try to quickly jump into a state of resilience or a state of hope that things are going to be okay, I think that's premature. And I think we have to be cautious of that. And then we gently, gradually work into a state where there can be some hope, there can be some exploration to the future. And that resiliency is something that is really amazing about our human race, is that we're extremely resilient beings. And so part of me is like, how do we then help individuals give a voice to that deep and profound grief that you're describing and transition ever so slowly into a place of strength, resiliency, honoring that self, coming back to that internal self that may have been collapsed into a state of strength and knowing I am of worth, value, I am lovable.
I have a couple thoughts on that. One of the texts that I was reading regarding grief said that when we get stuck in the mindset of there are stages or steps, it can kind of keep us stuck. And so it talked about tasks. If we have tasks or understand there are some tasks required to go through or that we go through for grieving, it kind of gives us a way through. And we've been
Mm,
talking about some of those today. First of all, is recognizing this is grief. Second of all, we have to find places where we can begin to create our story, that trauma narrative, and places where we can share it. Those
mhm,
things are going to help us. Once again, we're picking up all these pieces and we're putting them back together in our online Rise course. I think it's chapter 11. It's the longest chapter in there, but it's got a step by step, like here's how to put together your story and here's how to rehearse it and different ways to create that story part, which is so important. When we do formal disclosures, we have that impact letter where the betrayed partner reads their story. Here's the impact that this has had
mhm.
on me to their partner, their spouse who betrayed them. This is a reconsolidation part. And so, tasks going through is we have to identify it, we have to recognize what we're experiencing, give it that name, and then step into these tasks of the support that we need, creating the story, sharing the story. And these are the things that create resiliency because these are the tasks of reconnecting with myself, connecting with my reality. And acceptance is where all the emotions show up as we're doing this work, this is where we're working through all of the emotions. If I'm writing this down or I'm sharing it with somebody, oh, this is where all of this emotional energy starts to come out. I had a client working on her impact letter. She said, MaryAnn, I cried almost an entire day as I wrote this. And that is the work that we're talking about, making sense of it, letting the emotions out. These are
Mhm.
the tasks that have to be done to heal.
And one of my books that I often refer to is a book called Opening Up by Dr. James Pennebaker. And he talks about how when we repress certain thoughts, feelings, and emotions, when we keep them shoved down, it's not healthy for us physically or emotionally. In fact, people who, what he called expressive writing, that's his approach, is giving a voice, expressive writing. And he said when people do that, they increase their immune system and they decrease their depressive symptoms. And to me, that's really the power of what we're talking about here. And as I try to make that transition from giving it a voice, getting support, and into seeing myself come back of that collapsed self into that self that's no longer collapsed, but starting to blossom again and starting to flower and rise again, that beauty of that metaphor, right? And so that's what we're looking at here is rising through that resilient strength. And I think that we have to go through the grieving and transition into this resilient, stronger self. And I think that model really is the model of healing.
And along with that, I just want to keep it in perspective always. This takes time. It's a
Hmm.
process and it takes years. And I don't mean that you'll be stuck for forever in this space for years, but it is just a gradual process. There will be
Hmm.
times where, oh, there's something else I realized that, oh, yeah, I need to grieve for that. I didn't realize that. And it might be
Hmm.
years and years down the road, but with these resilience practices that we're talking about, these help us to better manage later on.
Yeah, and again, I think that is a process. And so we can speak to the ends of the spectrum, giving it a voice in the grieving process into the resilience. But at the end of the day, as you said, this is going to be a continuous effort and continuous growth process. But that's the strength of us as human beings, is we understand that we're going to ebb and flow. And I think as I've gotten older in life, I see the ebb and the flow. When we're younger, we don't see that we're going to get through certain cycles. We don't see how things end. And yet they do. And just as an example of that, I remember being a therapist early on in my career and then going through the housing bubble, 2008, 2009, 2010, and just seeing how that influenced my clients, seeing how that influenced myself, and how I had to be more protective and careful of how we spent money. And during that time, being very cautious and thinking, is this ever going to end? And then we go through a pandemic, same question about 10 years later. Are we going to get through this? What's the answer to this? What's the end result? And so as we go through the cycles of life, ups, downs, we recognize that they can end. And I'm not saying that betrayal ends. I'm saying that the pain that has been so powerfully distributed inside of us begins to lessen. And we begin to see things in new ways. And we begin to make more sense of our lives. And that's the process that we're trying to talk through, is that grieving process that transitions into a state where there is hope and you can be resilient.
And I hear you talk about that and just think about my clients that will say, oh, I didn't cry as much this week. Oh, I found a little bit more hope this week. It's not something that we can usually pinpoint, but it is as we grieve, as we allow ourselves to feel all of the emotions and let them come up and find appropriate ways to let them out, we change. This is
Mhm.
all about a changing process. We can never, ever go back to where we were before. Just I can't relive yesterday or the day before. We can't ever do that. And we progress onward with the knowledge that we've learned. And as we wrap up, the invitation that I would extend is just to be kind to yourself, to have that compassion, and to really look at where am I right now in my own grieving process, and what's my next task moving forward? What do I need more of?
That's great.
Yeah. Anything you want to wrap up with, Dr. Skinner?
Just thanks to the listeners for showing up. MaryAnn, this is really a very important topic, and the research that you're doing on this, just reiterate that in the show notes, they'll be able to take a grief assessment to see where they're at. Anyway, it may take, what, 10 minutes? But I think
This might be a little bit longer than 10 minutes. In addition to this assessment that we'll have available, we'd love it in the show notes. We also want to remind and encourage you that we've got the Human Intimacy Conference coming up on March 13th and 14th. And I'll be talking about making sense of grief and loss after betrayal. Dr. Skinner, you're talking about.
two things. I'll be doing a track on the first day on empathy and compassion and illustrating the difference between the two and why it's so important to understand. And then the second day, a 2 hour block where I'll be talking about the intimacy repair method.
It's going to be fantastic. There's going to be so much there. So we've still got our discount or promo code for that is
30 off.
we hope that you can sign up and join us, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Dr. Skinner.
And thank you, MaryAnn.
If this podcast is helpful to you, we ask that you please share it so that someone else may not feel so alone. You can also find our companion course at humanintimacy.com. We're so glad that you're with us.